Good evening, good morning, or whenever you're watching this, and thank you so much for joining us for Outward. I hope you're doing well today. I hope things are going well in your world. My name is Sam Quirk. I work with the youth at Spring Hill Church of Christ in Spring Hill, Tennessee, and it's great to be here with you today. It's difficult to be a Christian in an unchristian world, isn't it? It's a very difficult thing to be different in general. Being different is like that guy who's walking through a huge crowd of people all going the same direction, but then he realizes he left something and he has to go back through that crowd who is coming against him. Or in a funny way, it can be like showing up to an Alabama football game with a bright orange Tennessee or Auburn shirt on, looking different. Being different can also feel very lonely. Being different can make us feel really exposed, and it can be one of the most difficult things we ever do. Romans 12 verse 2 tells us, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Being different is what we're called to do. It's what we're called to be. But it's tough. It's difficult to be different. It does help, though, to see great examples of others who have conformed to God instead of to the world. So what I want us to look at today is the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who weren't Christians, they were Jews, but they are great examples of being faithful to God in the middle of a world that is against him and that is against his people. Even in a situation where they were expected to conform or they would be executed, or so they thought, or so they were told. Now, like I said, they weren't Christians, they were Jews. But anytime we can look in the Old Testament to a great example like them, we can be encouraged. And we can be encouraged to be like them in their faith. So turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. In the first 7 verses there in Daniel chapter 3, we'll see that Nebuchadnezzar has set up this golden image in the plain of Dura that he wants everyone to worship, and he calls all his officials, which would include Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to come to the dedication of this idol. And everyone there is commanded to worship the idol when they hear the instruments play. We'll start reading in verse 7. "So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." All the people, except for 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were falling down before this idol. Let's look starting in verse 8 there. "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up.'" So we see here, looking at our first point, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are about to have to make a choice. They have a choice that they have to make. Starting in verse 13, "Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?'" Arrogant king alert here. He says, "Who is the God who can deliver you from my hands?" And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew exactly the God who could do that. But in this situation, when faced with this choice, they could either choose God or choose to conform to the world. They could choose God, which according to the king would end up costing them their life. And what God can save them from the king? I mean, he told them that they would immediately be cast into the fiery furnace. They would lose their lives, right, if they chose God. And that's a steep punishment, losing your life, being cast into a fiery furnace. Normally in life when we're making choices, and one choice is that dangerous, that steep of a consequence, we're not going to choose that choice, right? But that's only if the other choice doesn't have an even worse punishment, an even worse consequence. Because if they chose to conform and worship the idol, that would be violating a higher command from a higher authority than the king. And it would result in a worse consequence, being separated by sin from God and losing their soul if they didn't repent. So when we're thinking about being Christians in an unchristian world, being faithful to God like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the middle of a society that was against God, that was against God's people and God's ways, when we're thinking about being faithful to God in a society in a time like that, let's remember that when we choose God, yes, we will have consequences, but when we choose conformity, when we choose the world, we're going to have even more severe consequences from that. So let's choose God. Let's choose the better choice. So now let's take a look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's decision. Starting in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Look at this decision that they made. They chose God over, first, the societal expectations. Everyone else is doing it. Everyone else is bowing down before this idol. Everyone else that they know is prostrating themselves before this golden image. But they didn't do it. They chose God over what society expected them to do. Second, they also chose God over their position among the king's important people. They were important. They had been, along with Daniel, the best of the ones who served before the king in Daniel chapter 1. They were considered 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers that were in the king's realm, as we see in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20. And then in Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, we see that the king set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. They were putting their important position among the king's people on the line at this time. But they were also putting their safety on the line. They were choosing God over their safety. How important that is for us to see. What a great example that is for us to see, that they chose God even above their own safety. Do we do that as well? There was a fiery furnace prepared for those who wouldn't bow before the idol. And they chose God over being saved from that fiery furnace. So how did they do it? How do you have this level of commitment to God? How do you choose God over the fiery furnace when that's what's being thrown in your face in that moment? Yes, the consequence of giving in and conforming to the world is greater, for sure, than the consequences of being faithful to God. But in the moment, in the face of that fiery furnace, how do you say, I'm standing up for God? How do you make that choice? What I want us to see is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a solid faith in God. Their faith was very solid in God. They were holding up that shield of faith, deflecting these very fiery darts from Satan. Look at this faith. Look back with me in verses 17 and 18. It says, if that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They 100% believed that God had the ability, he had the power to deliver them physically from the fiery furnace. And they trusted in him in that way, and that's awesome. But their faith was deeper than that. They didn't just trust that God was able to deliver them from the fiery furnace. It wasn't just a trust that God was powerful enough to deliver them, but also it was a faith that was a living and working faith. It was an obedient faith. One that said, if God doesn't deliver us physically out of this fire, we're still not going to worship this idol. We're still going to be faithful to him. It was a living faith that was trusting and obedient. That's the faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. And that's the faith that we can have as well. When we're tempted to give in to conforming to this world, to being just like the rest of the world, to looking like non-Christians in this unchristian world, let's remember to have a faith like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, that will stand against those fiery darts of Satan. And so we see that they stood up for God. They would not bow down to that idol, and God delivered them. Not just spiritually, even though we can trust that He definitely will deliver us spiritually, but He delivered them physically as well. Starting in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, and their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, language, which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They were different. They were different from the society around them. They were different from the other officials in the king's court. They were different from the ones who were trying to avoid this fiery furnace. And God delivered them. And God will deliver us as well. Now, whether or not He delivers us from physical punishment, that's up to God. And they recognized that. But they were still going to be faithful to Him, even if He didn't physically deliver them from the fire. And we can have that same commitment as well, that even if God doesn't deliver us physically, we're still going to have that living faith, that obedient faith in Him, that we're going to trust God and obey Him no matter what, and we're going to stand up for Him. It's hard to be different. It's hard to stand up in the middle of a society that is so against Him and against His ways and against His people. But we can look at great examples like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who even though there seemed to be extraordinary consequences for standing up for God, they still had a faith that stood up through the temptations to conform. So do you want to be a Christian, a faithful Christian in the middle of an unchristian world? Then let's increase our faith. Let's work on having this faith in God that stands up and that obeys Him even when things are difficult, even when it's hard to obey. Let's have that kind of faith that trusts that God can physically deliver us from the ones who want us to conform. A faith that trusts and obeys God even if we aren't physically delivered, and that trusts that God will ultimately deliver us spiritually in heaven for eternity, which is where our ultimate deliverance comes. Let's be faithful Christians in the middle of this unchristian world. Let's be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood up even when the fiery furnace is being thrown in their face, even when they are thrown into the fiery furnace. We can be faithful to God like that, and we can be faithful Christians in the midst of an unchristian world. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have an awesome day.